Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kenneth Lapotin. I'm curator of antiquities here at the Getty Villa. Or maybe today I'm Bacchus himself. We'll see. In either case, I'm delighted that you've all decided to join us for another in our Bacchus Uncorked series. Today's program is entitled Making Wine in Ancient Rome, From Spectacle to Reality. As many of you, I think, already know, our Bacchus Uncorked wine programs explore ancient art, wine, and the culture of the ancient world through talks on the archaeological context of wine cultivation and drinking practices. Now, it's not really that often that we here at the Getty Villa are terribly topical, but a major feature article on the subject of today's program, the site of the Villa dei Quintili in Rome, and the research of our first speaker, Imlin Dodd, appeared just this morning in the Washington Post. And I encourage you all to have a look at that when you have a chance. Now, our first speaker today is Imlin Dodd, a lecturer in the Institute of Classical Studies at the University of London. Previously, he served as Assistant Director for Archaeology at the British School in Rome, and he's also a research affiliate of the Australian Archaeological Institute in Athens, an honorary fellow at Macquarie University, and elected fellow of the Society of Antiquaries London and the Royal Historical Society. He is an active field archaeologist, co-directing the Faleri Novi project in central Italy, as well as survey projects in the Cyclades in Greece, investigating the production of wine, oil, and agricultural technology in the classical to the late antique eras. He's also an active collaborator with the Antokia ad Cragnum archaeological research project in southern Turkey, where he will be in about 3 or 4 days from here. And he's previously worked on the Greek island of Delos, in the Athenian Agora, and the Acropolis, as well as at Pompeii, Atlantis, and elsewhere in Italy. Today, he will share with us his fascinating research into the luxurious imperial winemaking establishment at the Villa dei Quintili, just outside of Rome. After Imlin's talk of about half an hour, we will be joined on the podium by Diego Meraviglia, who might be known to many of you from previous Bacchus Uncorked programs. Diego is president and director of education for the North American Sommelier Association. He holds the Gold Pin certification from both the Italian Sommelier Association and the Worldwide Sommelier Association. He is a certified master taster. How do you get that job to be I think you have to study a lot, but he'll tell you more about that. He's a certified master taster and a certified specialist in wine with the Society of Wine Educators in the United States. In 2009, he was awarded the International Villasandi Award for Innovation in the Profession of Sommelier, and in 2011, he finished 5th at the International Sommelier Association's Best Sommelier in the World competition. A native Italian, Diego is passionate about archaeology and ancient European history with a focus on his native land's Celtic and Gaulish heritage. He cooperates with various wineries as a consultant and is a regular public speaker. So without further ado, I give you first Imlin Dodd, then Diego Meraviglia.
Thank you very much, Ken, for your kind, generous, and extensive introduction with plenty of useful information. And I hope that I will give you some more useful and interesting information over the next half an hour. But before we get to that, I'd like us to first zoom out and take a broader perspective to observe not just the equipment and the technologies that wine was made with in the Roman era, that wine was stored and fermented in and underwent its entire production process, but also to look at some broader examples from across the Greco-Roman world. Using this great quantity of evidence that we as archaeologists now have at our disposal, it's possible for us to start observing some trends and some patterns that are emerging, as well as to acknowledge that wine production in the ancient world took place on a vast spectrum of scales and methods and processes. And it's in this manner that our observations as researchers in today's world, looking back into the past, are starting to become much more nuanced. For example, we now know that there are many examples of facilities focused purely on practical aspects of production, without any notion of going beyond the essential processes of extracting juice from grapes in a manner that need not be complicated. But there are also facilities, as we'll explore later on, that were much more lavish. The complete other end of the spectrum of opulence, performativity, and sensation, rivaling even some of the finest bathhouses and religious spaces in the ancient world. So in what follows, I will explore some examples of all of this, ranging from the most practical to the most luxurious, the most theatrical to the most down-to-earth, sometimes linked as well to specific regional and local production habits. I'd like as well to start with a very brief overview, a crash course, if you will, for those not so expert in ancient wine production, as well as some of our key archaeological and artistic evidence for all of this. Before any production could occur, of course, grapes had to be harvested, and we have plethora of information for this throughout the ancient world, often occurring in relief on things like sarcophagi, like this fantastic example, one of my favorite examples from the Roman period, which is held, in fact, here in the Getty collection. And as well, this example in mosaic from the Santa Costanza mausoleum just outside of Rome. Both depicting cherubs, or putti, in the bottom example, harvesting grapes, picking them before they could be turned into wine. A lot of these depictions revolve around fantastical notions, kind of mythical notions of wine production, and a celebration of the vendemmia, this ancient vintage harvest. Now, of course, the Romans couldn't really lay claim to these production habits and these cultivation aspects. These had already been around for millennia. And the recent discovery, very recent, I think, in the last few years, which actually appeared in National Geographic, of a very large winemaking facility in the Levant, which is visualized here, gives us some fantastic evidence for this. This was discovered in what is now modern Lebanon and is a Phoenician facility. Once the grapes had been cultivated, they were dumped in large vats like this from a much earlier period onwards, and still used in the Roman era and even up to today, to be trodden. And we hear from our ancient agricultural writers, sources like Pliny the Elder, Columella and Palladius, who give us very specific instructions on treading the grapes, and they tell us that this produced the highest and the second highest qualities of wine. So we start to understand a bit about qualities in the ancient world for wine through this too. This can even be taken further back, much earlier than the Roman period. On the left, an example from Bronze Age Greece, a site called Vathipetro in Crete, where we have simple ceramic tubs into which grapes were put and trodden on, and the grape juice flowed into the lower tub before it was fermented into wine. We have many depictions as well on your kind of typical classical black figure painted jars and vases and so on, of satyrs and maenads, more fantastical notions of this vendemmia, this vintage festival, making wine and treading on grapes. In the Greek depictions, interestingly enough, much earlier than the Roman period, they often use these wooden kind of structures that they're treading grapes on. And this is frustrating to archaeologists because they never survive down to today, so we have very little information on them apart from what we get in the art. Following all of these treading processes, what was left of the grape pulp and the skins, the seeds and so on was gathered up, and it was put into either woven baskets or inside wooden boxes, and then placed under one of a variety of pressing mechanisms that already existed by the Roman era. These could take the shape of a large wooden lever, and you can see an example of this reconstructed on the right from Pompeii. Or it could take the place of a screw mechanism, which placed pressure directly down onto the grapes, and you can see this depicted in the left from a mosaic in the Eastern Mediterranean much later. There are a wide variety of pressing mechanisms that were used and existed by the Roman era, and the Romans really took this to another level in terms of technological change and innovation. But, as you'll see over the next half hour or so, this doesn't mean that technology progressed in a linear fashion. We have thousands of millennia-old technology used alongside new inventions like the screw very frequently. After the grapes were trodden and then pressed, the juice, or the must as we call it, was expressed and was channeled into various vats or large ceramic jars. We call these dolia as archaeologists. Modern winemakers also call them amphorae, but they're essentially the same concept. These large ceramic jars sunk into the ground to create a nice constant microclimate for the wine to ferment in and to be stored in. And a special note, and just a kind of small digression here, these cellaring production processes and infrastructure that's associated with it is inherently micro-regionalized. We know already by antiquity that the Romans and the Greeks before them understood that climate and so on changed by micro-region, and they adapted their equipment to suit that. We see dolia used only in certain parts of the ancient Mediterranean, and we see other types of cellaring processes occurring in other parts of the Mediterranean where the climate was different. Now, much of this has inspired modern archaeologists, as well as modern winemakers, to collaborate, and this has kind of occurred in tandem with the rise of experimental archaeology as an avenue of scientific investigation. And we've seen numerous attempts in reconstructing and recreating ancient Roman winemaking and the wine itself. And perhaps one of the best known of these, along with another very well-known example that took place in Pompeii, which some of you may have tasted, the Villa dei Misteri wine. Perhaps another one of the best examples is this that you can see on the screen, which is actually in southern France, where an enormous to scale Roman winery was reconstructed over the actual Roman villa site. And you can visit it today, you can watch them recreate the vintage and the wine production process using this enormous lever and winch mechanism to press the grapes and create the wine. And they actually sell the wine that they produce here at this winery. They try to be as authentic as possible. They add spices and flavors and herbs and seawater and all these kind of weird and wacky things that we know the Romans and the Greeks added into their wine. And you can buy it and have a taste and see if you like it. Now, before we get into the high-end stuff, the wine of the emperors, as Ken was alluding to at the Villa of the Quintilli, it's equally as important, from my perspective, to recognize the myriad evidence we now have for practical and small-scale wine production across the Roman and the ancient Mediterranean world. And as a first example, I'd like to focus momentarily on these rock-cut facilities, which were certainly used to produce wine in antiquity, and you'll see in the title of this slide, were also probably used to produce olive oil in certain places, and we can't rule out this as a possibility many times too. So these facilities include very simple basins or vats hewn out of the bedrock or rocky outcrops in certain parts of the Mediterranean, into which grapes were placed and then trodden or pressed or crushed, with the resulting liquid collected in a vat, also often cut out of the rock too. So they represent a very basic method of leveraging natural topography and resources to produce wine, and a visualization for us of using incredibly simple methods in a process that need not necessarily be complicated. Now, I approach these facilities in particular with a small caveat, and that is that they're incredibly difficult for us as archaeologists to date. Unless they've been excavated with well-defined stratigraphy. Some of them are undoubtedly ancient, and we have good evidence for this, but many others are probably Byzantine or medieval or even early modern. For example, in Italy, we have many examples of these. They're often called palmenti, and they were used well into the 19th century to produce wine. But what's more important here is that they're found in a relatively consistent form and shape across an exceptionally broad geographical area. The obvious examples that we have are located in Italy, in places like Sicily and Sardinia as well, but countless examples can also be seen across the Western Mediterranean as far as Portugal and Spain, across the other end to the east, in Cyprus and Crete, and the Levant and Turkey. The region of North Syria presents an incredibly interesting data set with over 1,000 of these facilities clustered around the late Roman villages, showing us that there was an incredibly dense production landscape over what is now called the Limestone Massif region. However, this continues much further to the east than we might traditionally expect. And facilities almost identical to these that are found all across the Mediterranean are found much further to the east in significant numbers in what is now the Swat Valley in modern Pakistan. And recent research into these facilities in this particular area, and I really need to acknowledge here an ongoing PhD project by Prabjit Johal at Toronto, provides very convincing evidence for these to be used as wine production facilities no later than the 5th century CE, so we're thinking the late Roman period here, But in this area, they're connected into Buddhist settlements, where Buddhist activities are controlling the agrarian landscape of northern Pakistan. And to give you a sense of density and scale, we have in one area, one facility for every 5 hectares. So we're seeing considerable effort to control and to make the most of this production landscape. So what do we make of all of these rock-cut wineries that present themselves almost identically over an enormous geographical and temporal scope? Firstly, they provide an intriguing example to us of the almost timelessness of wine production in antiquity, and even extending up to the early modern period, with slow-moving technological change, or even no change implemented when it wasn't necessary, and comparatively simple methods used to extract liquid from grapes in a process that didn't need to be complicated. They also show us just how global wine production could be in antiquity, visualized almost identically over an immense area. But at the same time, we start to see smaller and more nuanced aspects of localized production habits coming through. For example, in the North Syrian facilities, and more broadly across the Eastern Mediterranean as well, we often find stone rollers connected to these facilities and in situ. And this is because these particular facilities were used to produce a particular type of wine, and that is wine made from sun-dried grapes or raisined grapes, which required a much harder stone crushing surface to extract the juice, and were used to produce a very particular type of sweet wine, which the Romans called passum. And this was very commonly used in the kitchen. There's been some wild theories put forth that women particularly liked to drink passum in the Roman period because it was easily accessible to them in the kitchen. I've published on this, and I think it's not true, to put it kindly. But we know that passum was particularly popular in particular contexts, and it was produced primarily in these areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. So we start to see here a local response, no doubt informed by the local topography as well as traditional cultural practices used in the production of region-specific wines in the Roman period, but also dependent on a particular regional landscape, and in this case one with a plentiful stone resources available. Now, a similar form of wine production can be seen in perhaps both scale and process in urban areas, in the fabric of many Roman towns. While all of these rock-cut examples we've just discussed are predominantly found in rural contexts, outside the town walls, a similar degree of simplified winemaking shows us that we should not necessarily view winemaking or even ancient agriculture more broadly as happening in the countryside all the time. Many times it also happened much in the same manner inside the town walls. Now, as is often the case, for better or worse, Pompeii provides some of the best the best evidence in this respect, due, of course, to its exceptionally well-preserved nature as a Roman town. Here, inside Pompeii, tucked within the insula, the city blocks of this dense and busy urban fabric, modest-sized wine production facilities can be found, and we know of at least 4 locations confidently attributed to wine production, all of which are clustered in this southeastern area of the town you can see indicated with the stars on the map here. Interestingly enough, also clustered around the amphitheatre of Pompeii. Perhaps the most well-known is this example, the so-called Foro Boario facility. Interestingly enough, Foro Boario means cattle market. When it was excavated first over 100 years ago, they thought it was a cattle market for Pompeii. In the 1960s, when it was re-excavated, they actually discovered that it was a vineyard, a really sizable vineyard. But funnily enough, on all the tourist guides and maps, you will still see it labelled Foro Boario, even though we know better now. They really need to update it. The Foro Boario, though, the vineyard has largely been replanted now, thanks to a fantastic collaboration between the archaeological park and the modern wine producer Mastro Berardino. And in its adjoining structure, just here, it housed a small winemaking facility. You can see in plan here what was retrieved from the 1960s excavations undertaken by Wilhelmina Jastrzębski, a fantastic American archaeologist, and she managed to locate all of the locations of the vine roots, vine trenches and stakes, being able to reconstruct in its entirety this amazing ancient vineyard. Inside the adjoining structure, we have great evidence of a very modest-sized wine production facility inside the town walls of Pompeii. We have 10 dolia, you can see 8 of them in this picture here, large ceramic jars set into the ground. into which grape must flowed from the adjoining room, where there was a lever press and a treading area and a vat. So we've got the entire wine production process happening alongside the vineyard from which the grapes were taken. It's worth noting that this production inside the town of Pompeii is nowhere near the scale of the cellars we have just outside the walls of Pompeii in some of the villas at nearby Bosco Reale, which is not far from Pompeii. There are wine production facilities with about 70 or 80 of these dolia, so much larger cellaring facilities. This is, again, some of the biggest we have in Italy, but if you go to France or Spain at a relatively contemporary period, there are villas with 100, 200, or even more dolia, so absolutely mammoth wine production happening in France and Spain in the Roman period. So inside these urban contexts, we see relatively modest-sized facilities. The other examples inside the town walls of Pompeii, one of which is on the screen here, usually use simple treading areas with raised edges and coated in what we call cocciapesto, which is a waterproof plaster or cement kind of material, where the grapes would be dumped in and the juice collected in, again, a dolia just set next to the treading floor. Interestingly enough, in this facility in Region 2, juice also flowed through this wall into a peristyle garden inside the house itself, and in this way kind of brought production from the garden into the domestic spaces, interestingly enough. Another facility in nearby Region 1 of Pompeii is more restricted to the garden area. You can see a photo of it here. We have as well in this location an underground cellar. And it's difficult to access these days, but from the 1960s excavations, you get a great image here with a person to give you a sense of the scale of it. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the cellar is that it has several vents punched through its roof leading up to the surface here, and you can see them coming through the ground. The most interesting of which is this one above what is a large vat inside the cellar, and we think that wine was produced in the treading area, which is just off the photo down here. The juice was then transported over here and poured through this hole into the vat itself to ferment and be stored. So we've got a really nice different example of ground level and subterranean wine production going on. This urban setting that we see in Pompeii, exemplified in Pompeii, and that you can find in many other Roman towns, and the placement of wineries that we see within these houses and the gardens, with direct connections as well to tabernae, these shops. And you can see an example here of a vineyard behind and then easily connected into the shop, which fronts onto the road, illustrate a really different example of production organisation from the rural and rock-cut facilities we saw before. We might start to imagine in locations like Pompeii that grapes were grown and processed into wine on the same property, owned by the same family, and then sold at the same person's taberna, fronting onto the street. We start to see, therefore, a sort of intra-household economy where production was kept all within the same area. We might also imagine that other vineyards that we see inside and outside the city walls, where we don't have evidence for the actual production of wine, were then transporting and delivering their grapes to these urban facilities for processing. And hence we see a sort of cooperative emerging, like we still see today in modern Italy, especially for the production of olive oil. So this connectivity between areas of cultivation and production and sale and consumption, all joining up in this urban environment, illustrates to us as modern archaeologists this concept of the rural and urban divide that we really need to remove. We need to view these landscapes in Roman antiquity with considerably more nuance and considerable flexibility, melting away this kind of rural and urban divide and viewing this connection between agriculture and urban towns. Similarly, the movement of produce within and around the town, we imagine grapes, as I said, being carted to wineries and wine being transported from production facility to tabernae and shops. All of this would have created a very particular urban spatial dynamic in these areas of the town. And we start to imagine with some of the tabernae you can see visualized here, just recently excavated in 2018 in Region 5, and a reconstruction of how these tabernae opened out into the street. And you can imagine the carts going up and down with the wine and with the grapes inside them. All of this would have created a very particular feel for these areas of the town. And if we go back to the map here, this area of Pompeii with the wineries clustered around it, perhaps starting to become known as a sort of production area for the town, or a wine production kind of district. Finally, the most interesting thing to note in terms of this facility here, which is the Foro Boario vineyard and production site, we actually have two triclinia, or areas where people could recline to dine and eat and drink, just on the sides of this property right here, opposite the amphitheatre. So we can also start to imagine now wine being sold not just in the taberna, the shop of this property, but also being sold as a kind of experiential wine consumption activity where people would go to their gladiatorial event at the amphitheatre or whatever else was happening at the amphitheatre, and either on the way or after the event, they could stop into the vineyard, they could recline in the triclinia and eat and drink the local produce. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I'd like to discuss a very particular and recently discovered site that Ken alluded to, sitting at the complete other end of this production spectrum. It's not just larger scale in terms of production capacity, but it's opulent and spectacular in terms of decoration and architecture. The winery itself that we'll be talking about forms part of the complex at the Villa of the Quintilli, which sits just outside Rome on the Via Appia Antica, the ancient Via Appia, which led from the city, was one of the oldest consular roads that the Romans built, and led across Italy down to the heel of the peninsula. The winery itself, as I said, forms part of this larger villa complex, and you can see just how immense the villa as a whole is. It's this entire property with an immense monumental bathing complex and residential area, a huge porticoed garden, and then several rooms off it, and obviously a great deal that has not been excavated still. The Via Appia Antica, to give you a sense of orientation, is this road just here. So you could even enter the villa off the Via Appia through this monumental fountain structure that they built. But the winery is located just on the edge of it here and is built over another structure, which I'll show you in a second, and you can see it there. We know that this winery was built sometime at the end of the 2nd century or early 3rd century CE, on top, as I said, of another structure which was built by Commodus slightly earlier. And we know this because we found a stamp at the winery of the name of an emperor, the Emperor Gordian, which gives us quite a compressed chronology to date either the construction of the winery or the renovation of the winery too. The winery, which you can see from the air here, possesses features rather typical of Roman wineries, nothing that's particularly surprising in terms of its processes and technology. You get a very nice impression here of just how it's built over an earlier structure. Now, this is actually the starting gate of a circus that Commodus, the Emperor Commodus, had built here. So Commodus, when he took over this property, he killed the Quintilli brothers who built the villa originally and took over their villas and other properties. I'm very happy to chat about that over a drink later. It's a completely different story. But Commodus built a circus here when he took over the property to have his private chariot races happening at. When Commodus was finished, let's say, it was demolished and a winery was built just after, on top of the starting gates of this circus where the horses would depart from. And as I said, this winery possesses features rather typical of ancient Roman wineries. It has a large treading area up here. It has 2 areas for the pressing of grapes using big levers, one here which is very nicely preserved with the circular channel for the collection of juice to lead it back into the vat. Another press would have been located here, but fortunately or unfortunately, modern farmers have ploughed it completely and destroyed it, so we don't have any evidence of that press. It has a large vat here for the collection of the grape juice, the must, and a big cellaring area down here, which we'll see a bit more of in a second too. Now, although these features, as I said, are rather typical of ancient Roman wineries, the decoration and the architectural arrangement and the quality of materials used are almost unparalleled for any production context in the Roman world and even the ancient world more broadly. The treading floor, for example, up here, which, as you saw in the Pompeian example, was usually coated in a rather mundane waterproof cement, very practical material. Here it's coated in red marble, giving a completely different impression to those engaging with the facility, and also making it very difficult for the people trying to tread on the grapes to work. Marble gets very slippery when it's wet. If any of you have visited the Athenian Acropolis, which is of course all marble, it's very difficult to walk on it when it's wet. So we start to get a sense of the priorities in the construction of this facility. The prioritization of luxury materials for visual and other impressions over practicality. But here is where it starts to get really theatrical and interesting. The distribution between the treading and pressing areas up here and the cellar down here took the form of this niched facade, which is reminiscent of a nymphaeum, these monumental fountains that the Romans would build. The facade takes the shape of these 5 niches, alternating in semicircular and rectangular shapes. The 3 in the middle conveyed wine in a fountain kind of movement. We can imagine the wine sitting in the vat here and coming out of these holes, fountaining into these channels down here. Interestingly enough, the 2 on the outside didn't convey wine, they actually conveyed water. It was channeled in from an aqueduct from outside the property, came out of the fountains on the exterior, and was then channeled back underground through a system of lead pipes. So we start again to get a sense of really interesting priorities at this facility, a sense of spectacle and theatrics emerging. Once the wine came out of the fountain facade here, it was conveyed into the cellar area through these channels. And these channels, once again, we should probably not be surprised at this point in time, are coated in marble veneer, white marble channels. So you can imagine the grape must coming out of it, whether it was a red or an orange or a white color, contrasting with this bright white marble. From here, it was channeled into dolia, these big ceramic jars set into the ground, of which there were 8 in this area and another 8 down here. So we get to a bit of a sense of production scale with 16 dolia in this instance. Now, aside from this remarkable level of decoration and theatre, which sets this production facility completely apart from the rock-cut examples and the urban examples that we saw earlier, the Quintilli Winery also presents an interesting example of what we might term conspicuous production or conspicuous consumption. We also have at the facility, arranged around the cellaring area, which is in the middle here, 3 of these rooms, which we've interpreted as dining rooms or areas for relaxing and eating. The one room that was excavated, and there's another room back here and another room over here which are unexcavated, and we're hoping to find funding to continue excavating. The one room that was excavated here, and you can see the pavement is covered up in this photograph for conservation reasons, but is paved entirely like this. All coloured decorative marble in a geometric shape. We call this opus sectile. And this particular design, which is a multi-star reticular design, we can date quite nicely to the 2nd to 3rd century CE. So it lines up very nicely with the stamp of the Emperor Gordian that we found in the collection vat, giving us a bit more of a concrete idea of the date for this facility. Now, this decoration, which is obviously very luxurious and very expensive, along with the wide entrances for these rooms, you can see provide an expansive view across the whole facility, the cellaring, and even up into the areas where people would have been working, suggests that they were used by the elite, or even, this is an imperial villa, it was owned by the emperor and the imperial family at the time, so perhaps even the emperor might have sat here, providing an area to eat and to drink and to watch this spectacle of production that unfolded. Now, it's immediately tempting at this point in time to draw comparison to the only other luxury winemaking facility that we know of. This is at a site called Villa Magna, only 50 kilometres to the southeast, so relatively close by to the southeast of Rome, and dating only 100 years earlier than the Villa of the Quintilli site, so just before the Quintilli production facility was built. And at Villa Magna, we have a winery, again, with similar marble-clad spaces. Here you can see a close-up of the floor of this cellar area, which is in white marble bricks in an opus spicatum herringbone design, providing, again, an incredibly luxurious and lavish production space. We know as well that Villa Magna was an imperial property owned by the emperor at the time, and indeed we have some fantastic literary evidence to support this, and this is where our friend Marcus Aurelius comes into the picture. At Villa Magna, at this point in time, Marcus Aurelius was soon to be emperor. His father was emperor. He wasn't quite there yet. And he tells us in his letters to Fronto, his tutor, where he describes how he banqueted and dined at Villa Magna, at this very villa, watching and listening to the workers treading grapes and producing wine. And you can see the quote on the screen here, where he talks about after they bathed, after the harvest, they dined in this pressing room and they watched the workers, he calls them peasants, treading the grapes. It's even possible as well that some of the production infrastructure was moved from this villa at Villa Magna and then implemented in the Villa of the Quintilli site shortly after. Indeed, yes. So the chronology between the two sites makes it possible that some of the equipment at Villa Magna was moved and put in place to the Villa of the Quintilli. Some of these dolia were considerably aged by the time they were used at Villa Magna, and the dolia at the Villa of the Quintilli were already 200 years old by the time they're used here. We've got some maker's stamps on the rim of the dolia telling us who made them, which gives us a really nice idea of how old they are. It's possible as well that this was quite a common occurrence. Some excellent research by another colleague of mine, Maureen Carroll, has given some great evidence that the imperial family, or the imperial patrimonium, liked to keep their equipment and their property within the family. She's got a great case where some of these dolia actually moved from the far south of Italy back up into central Italy. But what does this entirely different style of facility add to our knowledge of this vast spectrum of Roman wine production? Well, it clearly shows to us that production was not always practical, serving a direct agroeconomic purpose and using methods and architectures and technologies that simply did their job. Production could also fuse this sense of practicality with opulence. And we see this exemplified in the Villa of the Quintilli facility especially. It could be both utilitarian and elegant in style. The Quintilli winery as well might suggest a ceremonial or a ritual use tied to the opening of the vintage, this vendemmia that we saw depicted in the reliefs and the mosaics at the start of the talk. And Lisa Fentress, another colleague of mine, has convincingly argued for this at the Villa Magna facility, connected into the literary evidence we have, and suggesting that the Roman emperor would go there at the opening of the wine harvest in central Italy and undertake a ritual there. Extravagant marble decoration in both of these sites marked spaces fit for the emperor and his imperial court, and the winery then became a kind of theatre for this sacred performance. If we look, just going back one more, at the actual arrangement of the Villa of the Quintilli facility, we can start to get some sort of idea at this. We have the treading area raised up here for the workmen to work at, like a sort of stage in a theatre. We have the cellaring area set down and centralised, like the orchestra in a theatre. And we've got these dining rooms situated around the side, looking in like a kind of cavea, a seating area for the spectators. And as Nicholas Purcell, the well-known ancient historian, has previously described, ideological goals for the Roman elite then became inseparable from the business of production. So where have we arrived after all of this? Well, we've traced several examples of ancient Roman wine production facilities from perhaps one end of the spectrum to the other, in terms of scale and practicality and opulence. And while it's become clear that the elite of antiquity did occasionally fuse utilitarian and luxury structures to create spaces of extravagant production, the overwhelming majority of winemaking facilities and production spaces were almost certainly of those types that we saw in the first two sections. Smaller scale production complexes with inherent practicality that dominated the Mediterranean vinicultural landscape. And this trend, but also the diversity that we've seen just in these few examples, provides some real insight to us as archaeologists studying wine production in the ancient world. Not just in the Roman world, but in the ancient Mediterranean more broadly. Whether this involved people treading grapes out in the sun using these rock-cut facilities, hewn from the bedrock in the countryside, whether it was producers harvesting grapes in vineyards tucked away behind their homes in the city blocks of a town like Pompeii, then taking them into nearby buildings to transform them into wine. Or if it was at the other end of the spectrum, the elite or even the emperor, reclining and banqueting and watching workers tread grapes to the sound of music in these extravagant facilities like the Villa of the Quintilli. This diversity from kind of spectacle to reality simply shows to us that winemaking cannot so easily be pigeonholed, and that it was far more varied and nuanced and bespoke than we might have traditionally imagined. And from here, I'll pass over to Diego to tell you some more about modern wine. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully it's not your first time at Bacchus Uncorked. If it is, then you're in for a great treat. Thank you for the Getty, thank you to everyone at the Getty for having me over another time. This is one of the events that I look forward to the most every year. And thank you very much to Dr. Dodd, for an absolutely incredible presentation, one of the ones that I've enjoyed the most, because as a wine enthusiast and a person who's made wine his life, professionally and non-professionally, this presentation allows me to go into a lot of discussions on technical aspects of what would the wine have been? What would it have tasted like? Can we recreate it in modern day? And what has changed from the ancient Roman world of 2,000 years ago, putting into context the Villa dei Quintilli in this case, to what we would be enjoying and consuming today. So the question, what was wine like 2,000 years ago at the Villa dei Quintilli in those beautiful production facilities that we saw, not just the Villa dei Quintilli, but all the other ones that we noted, that we observed in the previous presentation. And the even bigger question is, would we want to drink them? Because I think that when you think about wine being the product of Mother Nature and man, 50% Mother Nature and 50% man, right? The notion that there can be no wine that doesn't start in the vineyard, that wine is made in the vineyard. It's still a philosophy of most, if not all, of the wine-producing companies or individuals around the world. But how much does that percentage change throughout history? How much does man become more prominent in the profile of wines that we've enjoyed in the last decades all the way to today? And how much would be Mother Nature? So we will observe the philosophy of wine back in the ancient world and how they would enjoy it, how they would consume it, evidence of the types of wines that they would have back then. Then we would look at the areas that they would cultivate, how they would cultivate, and what grape varietals would be cultivated back in those days. I think that before the end of the 1800s, it is safe to say that there wasn't really a notion of microbiochemistry in terms of wine. It was only with the works of Pasteur at the end of the 1800s that we discovered yeast through the microscope, that we actually realized that there's a microorganism that lives on the skin of the grapes, that lives in the air of the environments of the vineyards and in the cellars, and that once that grape is crushed and the juice flows out and the sugar is exposed, that microorganism starts to eat that sugar and transform it into ethyl alcohol, creating heat and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Now, in the ancient world, they wouldn't have had a notion of that. They would have seen the bubbling, definitely, through the process of fermentation. That was the CO2, but they wouldn't have known it was CO2. They wouldn't have known of the existence of yeasts. And hence, it is at the end of the 1800s that we start seeing the imprint of man becoming a lot more evident in the profile of the wine and the way the wine smells and the way the wine tastes. Back in those days, it's safe to say it would have been far more a matter of circumstance, of environment, of Mother Nature, and of factors that were not in the control of whoever was producing the wine. But one thing for sure, and we shall see, that was under their control and was definitely under their knowledge was the vineyard sites. The types of grapes, the flavors that they gave in the wines, where they were grown, where they would perform better, how they would perform better too. We will see how different grapes were cultivated, and there's evidence of this through the ancient world in different ways. Different training of the vines, different yields of the vines, which meant as evidence that they definitely had an understanding that wine started in the vineyard. But as far as the wine is concerned in terms of enjoyment, why it was so prominent throughout the ancient world, we can safely say throughout many researches and evidence and archaeological evidence that, wine in Roman times were used for celebration, right? To free and to relax the mind. I mean, we've heard it just recently with the pandemic at how wine is recession-proof, right? Because if you're happy, you drink to celebrate, and if you're sad, you drink to forget. So wine basically always has a place in society and will never go away, which is a really good thing. For recreational purposes, right, as a thought-provoking and philosophizing catalyst. And I love this because I think that we've lost a bit of that ancient symposium concept of how wine was a lubricant of the mind. a substance to enjoy, but also to act as a catalyst for discussion, for philosophy, for debating. Symposium itself coming from the ancient Greek notion of a drinking party, right? Often, with discussion, with talk, with debating on whatever terms there may be. I've tried to lubricate my mind since I was 5 years old, more or less, being Italian. I don't know if it worked or it didn't, but we shall see. And definitely as a status symbol. Definitely as a status symbol. So we see these very luscious villas filled with luxury, the Villa dei Quintili being a prime example, and wine being associated with a certain level of status. The ancient world, the ancient Roman world, is full of very widespread, very commonly found quotes in Latin regarding wine, right? When wine goes in, wisdom goes out. Bronze is the mirror of the body, and wine is the mirror of the mind. Again, we're back to this lubricant of thought, this lubricant of the spirit and of the mind. And then the most famous, of course, in vino veritas, right? And in wine there is truth. These notions have carried out throughout society for centuries. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was the individual who said that in beer there is strength, in wine there is wisdom, and in water there is bacteria. So central to the villa life is this product of man and nature, right? Utilized to host and entertain important guests, to boast the prestige of the identity of the villa, and I'm sure there was a certain competitiveness as well in terms of the quality of the wine, the production of the wine. The ancient world is full of examples and evidence that there were wines that had a bigger reputation, right? Not just the Falernum, which is the famous, wine of the ancient Roman era that we shall look at briefly later, but also the Nepenthe di Oliena, made in Sardinia, right? Nepenthe, right? That concept of a medicine to make you forget your sorrow, right? A wine that's still produced to this day. Both Falernum and Nepenthe di Oliena are still produced where they were thousands and thousands of years ago. And even the notion of us, like the sommeliers, right? The wine stewards was born with the haustores back in those days. So we had already this notion of these wine stewards that were meant to curate the wine, serve it in the proper way, cellar it in the proper way, advise, talk about it, and what sommeliers would do in modern day, in the modern day Western world. So what were the wines that they were enjoying 2,000 years ago? What would have been, some notions of the types of wines that they would be drinking and consuming in the Villa dei Quintili and other villas about 2,000 plus years ago? So we know for a fact that in ancient Rome, wines were diluted, they were spiced, and they were sweetened. That doesn't mean that they were always consumed that way. There may have been individuals that did not alter the wines in any shape or form. But we do know throughout ancient Roman history that it was common to do this, diluted with a sauce called garum, diluted with seawater, for instance, spiced with various spices, or sweetened with honey. A sort of modification of the wine to suit an individual's palate, to please one's flavor profile, to research some kind of preference or personal preference of enjoying and consuming the wine. Now, this would be sacrilege today, right? Any winemaker would probably have nightmares if he knew that you were putting honey in his wine or spices or diluting it. I don't advise you dilute it with seawater, definitely not here in the Pacific Ocean of LA. But for sure, this must have had a component not just of personal preference, but also of the fact that going back to this lack of understanding in science, in microbiochemistry, in the concept of fermentation, they would have often probably had wines that were faulty or flawed or altered. Things that would be like today, you'd call them funky, right? That probably would have been very, very common. If you think about the lack of sanitation that would have been around in those years, and pressing the grapes without having any filtering, for instance, that did not exist, and temperature control during the fermentation that did not exist, and even the lack of knowledge of yeasts. Today, it's common that wineries add yeasts that they've selected to the vats with the pressed juice before fermentation, so that they know what kind of result they're going to achieve. There's certain levels of sanitation today that wouldn't have been around in those days. So it's pretty safe to say that most likely, most of the time, you probably would not want to drink the wine that was being enjoyed back in the day. But we have evidence. We have evidence in the wine bars of Pompeii, in the menus that were found in the wine bars in Pompeii, painted on the walls, that they did have a series of categories of wine that were more based on the grape varietal and the origin of the wine, not so much in the method of production. So the wines were divided by the color of the grapes that they would come from, all the way from a straw, light yellow white wine, down to a dark red, and even austerum, so dry and potent. Think of a tannic, big, powerful red wine coming from the more bold grape varietals and coming from certain environments, certain terroirs, so to speak, that French term that signifies a sense of place or an environment, an origin of the vineyards. We still use austero as a term today in Italy to define wine, and that carried through thousands of years. So definitely the vineyards, definitely the origin of the grapes. And going a little bit into some technicalities of wine production, contrary to what we see in the modern day world, and I love this picture. I gave myself the liberty of stealing it from Dr. Dodd. I apologize, but it is a great starting point to start understanding what could have been different in the wines back then and the wines today. First of all, no oak and no barrels. Right? We don't see that. This is very important. We know from Pliny the Elder that it was the Gallic tribes of the northern part of the empire, so the Cisalpine Gaul, which is western Italy, and the Transalpine Gaul, which would have been, modern-day France. We know from Pliny's writings that when he visited up there, he saw that these Gauls that had become Roman citizens had these containers, and he mentions them, calling them these wooden containers as big as houses that would house the wine, that would contain the wine. Wood was the primary raw material of the Gauls. It was the primary raw material back then. They did not use clay containers primarily. They would use wooden containers. They quickly learned, of course, that the wood would alter the flavor of the wine, correct? These oaky notes that we like maybe in our Napa Cabernet Sauvignons and our French Bordeaux's, that spice, that vanilla, that chocolatey note that comes from the oak. The micro-oxygenation as well that the oak provides the wine that softens its palate, it softens its profile, so it does impact the wine. You would have had none of that 2,000 years ago in the area of the Villa dei Quintilli. They would not have been using wooden barrels. They would have been using the Dolia, buried underground, these clay containers. So you would not have gotten those profiles. Also, one thing that we must realize is that there was no differentiation between white grapes and red grapes in terms of the wine making. In modern day winemaking, it is commonplace that when you harvest white grapes, you press them and you eliminate the skins and you ferment just the juice to retain that purity, that freshness, that lighter bodied style that you research in a white wine, that you want in a white wine. Red grapes is different. Red grapes go through maceration on the skins to extract the tannin, to extract the color. In the ancient world, it is safe to say, and we have evidence of that, that they were treated in the same way. So you would have had white wines that would have been quite different to the white wines that you enjoy today, although we are seeing in the last decade or so a resurgence, a renaissance in the modern wine world of making white wines this way, of macerating them on the skins, of aging them and fermenting them in these clay dolia. Northeastern Italy in the region of Friuli, bordering with Slovenia, there's a lot of examples there. We can go to the country of Georgia, where the things are still done that way. And if you've ever had a chance to try these wines, they're very different from any white wine that you would commonly expect. The wines would have been heavily oxidized too. The lack of the modern technology to protect the wine from oxygen would have caused the majority of wines to be heavily oxidized. So these darker colored white wines, these brown tinted white wines with more of these honey, oxidative, barley cereal kind of flavors that come from the oxidation. So if you think of your modern day Pinot Grigio, super clean, super crisp, all floral, that would not have existed for sure 2,000 years ago in these times. And the minimal intervention, again, the lack of selected yeast, these spontaneous fermentations that would have occurred that could have gone well or they could have gone bad. They would have made the wines far more rustic, far more earthy. I'm sure many of you have heard in wine terminology the term barnyard, or wines that smell of, wet dog in a phone booth, some people say. These funky, animal-y kind of smells and flavors that would have come from wild yeast fermentations that it would have been a fluke if it turned out great and fruity and clean, but most likely, the majority of the time, they would have had this funky character. So the notion of the vineyards remains central to what the Romans carried out and gave to us through history. The Etruscans, when they were incorporated into Roman society, were prominent agricultural consultants for grape growing and vine cultivation. And we see throughout history and throughout the study of the ancient Roman world that there was a definite, clear notion of vineyard. In Pompeii, we don't just see evidence of wines being divided by type, but we see evidence of wines being divided by origin, where you do find a menu in one of the wine bars in Pompeii on the wall that says you pay this amount for a white wine, this amount for a bigger, stronger, red wine, and then you pay the higher premium for the Falernum. And Falernum is a specific place. It's a specific vineyard right there, and it's located in northern Campania, right on the border with the region of Lazio, which is the region where Rome is located. So all these ancient wine names of the ancient Roman world, focusing primarily on the region of Lazio around Rome, the region of Campania near Naples, and the island of Sicily, would have been what we could call today single vineyards. So a wine that carries the name of the vineyard where the grapes are coming from. This meant that they realized that there was something special or something unique about grapes grown in that area. And the unique concept that we see throughout all of the ancient vineyards and ancient wineries located in this area is the notion of the volcanic environment. All the way in at the beginning of Lazio with the extinct volcanoes, but down into even the or let's say, recently extinct volcanoes to the active ones still to this day, the Vesuvius. So there was definitely, we can trace that the most famous wines of the ancient Roman world, the most written about, the most mentioned, or where there's evidence of a mention, come from areas that contain volcanic activity. And that means volcanic soils. And we know how important this concept is for quality winemaking, still to this day. Those volcanic soils, rich in minerals, rich in substances that provide flavor, that provide character. They're also soils that have an excellent drainage, which is a very, very good thing for vineyard cultivation. The vine is not a plant that likes stagnant water. So these were notions that the Romans definitely had in mind. And they would have produced wines of complexity, they would have produced wines of structure, of elegance, and of very distinct personality. Falernum being one of them, still produced to this day, and we shall see a picture of the vineyards. Now, where would have the most important or famous wines in the Roman world come from, at least in this area? If we focus on the Villa dei Quintili, we can deduce that the grapes would have come from around the villa in that area, but the wines enjoyed throughout that period would have come primarily from two locations. The first one, the very, very famous Campania Felix, which is the happy countryside. The region of Campania in Italy comes from the ancient term of Campania Felix, that the Romans would call it, the happy countryside. Why happy? Because the climate, the soils, provided a quality of crop with flavor and character that was unparalleled in the Italian peninsula back then. You would have had 2 harvests per year, not of grapes, because the vine is a cyclical plant, only 1 harvest, but definitely of tomatoes, definitely of fruits, definitely of other produce. Vesuvio is also famous for some specific tomatoes. If you've ever had a chance to try the Pomodori del Piennolo del Vesuvio, they are absolutely incredible. The flavor is just absolutely incredible. So this notion of Campania being a prime crop growing region in the ancient Roman world is clear-cut. And in this area, we find grape varietals, three whites, Falanghina, Fiano, and Greco, and 2 red grapes, Aglianico and Piedirosso, which are traditional, ancient, and typical of this area. Falernum being made with Falanghina. This grape varietal that takes its name from the phalanx because it's a high yield producing grape, and they would plant the spears, the military spears in the ground to tie the vines to and increase the production. You know, higher vine training, more grapes, lower vine training, less grapes, but you trade off quality. So this notion was definitely present back in the ancient day. This is Pompeii with the Vesuvius, where Dr. Dodd spoke adamantly about, and we talked about the vineyard of Mastro Berardino that produces the Villa dei Misteri wine. This is Falernum, so right at the top of Campania, bordering with Lazio, not too far from Rome at all, is the area still produced to this day of the Falerno del Massico, which is the Falernum. This is a picture I took a couple of years ago in a winery called Villa Matilde. This would have been the vineyards of Falernum. This is 2-3 years ago, and this was the ancient site. And the beautiful thing about the winery is the museum that they house, where you can see every single year when they till the vineyards, they come up with some ancient Roman tool, some ancient Roman piece of amphora, some ancient Roman piece of equipment, every single, and they're all like cleaned and housed in this museum section of the winery that shows you as proof how the Romans were focusing on this area to produce grapes for one of their most famous wines. If we look at the map, we find ourselves pinpointing the location of the Villa dei Quintili, and not too far south, very, very close, you have 2 volcanic lakes that used to be volcanic craters. One is the Lago di Nemi, and one is the Lago di Albano. And in this area called the Castelli Romani, we find a series of towns around this ancient volcanic site, like Frascati, Marino, Velletri, Marino, Frascati, Velletri, that are actual wine denominations. So you can still go to the area today and drink a Velletri DOC, you can drink a Frascati DOC, and you will tonight, and you can drink a Marino DOC. So these towns all producing their wine taking the name of the town, focused around these volcanic lakes. And these are some of the most ancient, traditional, and historical wines of the region of Lazio. So it's safe to say that they would have been the wines enjoyed at the time in the area. A little further east, we encounter where the majority of the red vineyards, red grapes, are grown and located. A little more to the east in the area of the Castelli Romani that I just talked about. So this area here, we're focusing primarily on whites. So what are the grape varietals? Grape varietals for the ancient times and grape varietals for this evening too. So Trebbiano, a very ancient grape that's actually Italy's most planted white grape, would have definitely been around in those days. It was distributed throughout the Roman Empire quite adamantly. The Romans brought it to France in their expansion, and it was planted in France where it's called Ugni Blanc in French, and it's utilized for distillation. So if you drink a cognac or you drink an Armagnac, it is made largely with Trebbiano. In Italy, it is the most planted grape. It's a very widespread grape, and it has these characteristics of being a neutral varietal. A varietal that doesn't have any particular flavor, but it does produce a lot of grapes. So we have a high-yielding varietal, pleasant acidity that makes it thirst-quenching, it makes it pleasant, it makes it refreshing with a good acid, and it's normally blended with a flavoring agent, so to speak. So another varietal that gives it the perfume and the aromas that the wine showcases. And that other varietal, which is the other most planted grape in the region of Lazio, is called Malvasia, an ancient Greek grape that was brought into the Italian peninsula by the Greeks and then utilized by the Romans and expanded by the Romans throughout the empire. And the beautiful thing about Malvasia is that it's an aromatic grape. So it's a very perfumey and very intense grape. Think something similar to like a Moscato in terms of varietal, something very distinctive. In scientific terms, Aromatic varietals are grapes that you can smell and taste the flavors of the varietal just by eating the grapes without even having to ferment them before you can distinguish between one varietal or the other. So this is the most important flavoring agent in the region of Lazio. And the wines that we will try this evening will contain amounts of this varietal, the white wines. As far as the reds are concerned this evening, we will focus on Lazio's most ancient and important red grape, which is the Cesanese. Evidence that it's Lazio's most indigenous varietal and evidence that it's Lazio's most ancient grape. So most likely it would have been there during the time around the area of Rome and around the area, indeed, of the Villa dei Quintili. It is a very versatile red grape because you can produce quaffable and light-bodied red wines at the same time as potent, powerful, and tannic red wines, depending on the two biotypes. So there's two versions of Cesanese, one called Comune and one called Affile, which produce the two distinctive types. The Comune being lighter-bodied and quaffable, which you will try as your first red this evening, and the Affile being more potent, more tannic, and better suited for aging. A varietal that was kind of abandoned throughout the decades because it's a difficult grape to grow, but that has seen a resurgence in the last 10 to 15 years. So after these two lectures that I hope were not too long and boring, you'll be able to finally go up and drink, lubricate your mind, participate in a lovely symposium altogether. Nunca est bibendum, and now it's time to drink. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.